The 1920s believed in the future the way no era before or since has quite managed. Not cautiously, not with reservations. With the full, intoxicating, slightly unhinged confidence of a civilization that had just survived the worst war in human history and decided, collectively, that the correct response was to build something so modern, so electric, so aggressively new that the darkness of the preceding decade would simply be outpaced and left behind. Jazz clubs open until dawn. Automobiles filling streets that had known only horses a generation earlier. Department stores stocked with products that would have seemed like science fiction to a Victorian grandmother. And at the center of it all, the symbol of symbols, the miracle that stood in the popular imagination for everything that science and progress could achieve, was radium. Discovered by Marie Curie in 1898, radium arrived in the public consciousness not as what it actually was, a radioactive element of extraordinary danger, but as what the era needed it to be, proof that nature contained secret energies that modern science had unlocked for human benefit. It glowed. It was literally, visibly, luminously different from everything else in the material world. It pulsed with a cold blue-green light that seemed, to the minds of the 1920s, like the visual signature of the future itself. And so the era consumed it. Radium was added to water and sold as a health tonic. Radium-laced cosmetics promised luminous skin. Radium suppositories. Radium chocolate. Radium toothpaste, because what better way to give your smile the glow of the modern age? The element that would eventually be understood as one of the most dangerous substances a human body could encounter was, in the 1920s, a wellness product, marketed with the enthusiasm of an industry that had discovered a genuinely magical-seeming ingredient and absolutely no regulatory framework requiring it to understand what that ingredient actually did. Into this world, the United States Radium Corporation opened its factory doors in Orange, New Jersey, and offered young working-class women something remarkable, the most glamorous industrial job in America. The forbidden archives are open. The work was, by the standards of what was available to young working-class women in the early 1920s, extraordinary. The pay was exceptional. Dial painters earned more than most of their peers in other industries, more than teachers in some accounts, more than factory workers performing less skilled labor. The environment was light and social, the factory floor filled with young women working in close proximity, talking, laughing, developing the particular community that forms among people who share skilled repetitive work across long hours. There was a waiting list for positions. Families with multiple daughters tried to get multiple daughters placed. The United States Radium Corporation did not lack for applicants. The product being manufactured was military and civilian watch and instrument dials, the luminous faces that allowed soldiers to read the time in the trenches, that allowed civilians to check the hour in darkened bedrooms, that represented a genuine technological advancement in the utility of timepieces. The women who painted them were performing skilled work that required a steady hand, good eyesight, and the practiced patience of someone who had mastered a technique demanding enough to take time to learn. That technique had a name, a rhythm, a three-step sequence that the trainers communicated to new workers as the correct and required method for producing dials of sufficient quality. The brush was pointed with the lips, touched to the tongue or pressed lightly against closed lips to bring the bristles to a fine point capable of producing the precise lines the work required. Then dipped into the radium paint. Then applied to the dial face with the careful attention of someone who understood that the quality of her work was visible in the finished product and reflected in her pay. Hundreds of times per shift. Thousands of times per week. The technique was not improvised by careless workers. It was taught, demonstrated, required. It was the method the company had determined produced the best results, and the company enforced it as the standard. The women asked in the early days whether this was safe. The question was reasonable. The paint glowed. Even in the 1920s, even in the full intoxication of radium enthusiasm, even in the absence of any public understanding of radiation's biological effects, there was something in the experience of ingesting a glowing substance multiple times per hour that prompted the occasional moment of doubt. The supervisors reassured them. Not vaguely. Not with the noncommittal hedging of people who have not examined the question carefully. With the specific, confident, detailed reassurance of an institution that understood the value of certainty in managing its workforce. The paint was not merely safe, they were told. It was beneficial. Radium was healthy. Doctors recommended it. The glow was the visual evidence of vitality, of energy, of the modern age's gift to the body rather than a threat to it. The women went back to work. Here is the image that the historical record preserves, and that no amount of subsequent knowledge can make anything other than what it is, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a portrait of innocence so complete that the darkness coming toward it seems almost impossible to integrate into the same frame. The dial painters loved the glow. Of course they did. They were young women in the 1920s, surrounded by a culture that had made radium glamorous, working with a material that their employers had certified as healthy, earning wages that gave them access to pleasures their backgrounds had not previously provided. The glow was magical. The glow was modern. The glow was the visual signature of the era they were living in, and they were living in it more literally than almost anyone else. They wore their best dresses to the factory. This is documented, confirmed by multiple witnesses, a detail so specific and so human that it cuts through the century between then and now with complete immediacy. They wore their best dresses because the radium dust that settled on their clothing during the workday would make those dresses glow in the dark, and glowing dresses were a spectacle that the evening deserved. They would leave the factory at the end of a shift and walk home through the streets of Orange, New Jersey, trailing light, softly luminous figures moving through the ordinary darkness of a 1920s evening like something from a different category of existence. They painted their nails with the leftover paint. Their teeth, for the delight of watching their smiles glow when the lights went out. Their faces, for parties, for the particular joy of being extraordinary in the dark. Their boyfriends and families marveled at them. The scientific literature that would eventually explain what was happening to these women in those moments, the mechanism by which ingested radium behaves in the human body, the particular affinity of radium for calcium-rich tissue, the way it deposits in bone and continues its work from the inside with a patience that outlasts anything the body can mount against it, did not exist yet in any form accessible to the women themselves, or to their families, or to any of the people watching them. Glow and finding it beautiful. The poison was invisible. The glow was real. And the women walking home through the New Jersey dark, luminous in their good dresses, were already, in the clinical language that would eventually be applied to their cases, internally contaminated. The radium was already in their bones. The damage was already accumulating. The timeline that would end in pain and legal battles and early deaths had already begun, weeks or months or years before the first symptom appeared, in the thousands of repetitions of a gesture taught to them by their employer as the correct professional technique. They glowed in the dark and they were happy and they were dying and they did not know. The symptoms arrived quietly, the way serious illness often does, not as a dramatic declaration but as a gradual accumulation of things that could, for a while, be explained away. Fatigue that seemed disproportionate to the work. Aching in the joints that a young woman in her 20s had no ordinary reason to experience. Dental pain that led to extractions that did not heal the way extractions were supposed to heal. Bones that, when they eventually came to medical attention, showed damage that the doctors examining them had never seen in this pattern, in patients of this age, without a clear cause. The women went to their doctors. They went to the company. They went back to work because they needed the income and because the company's medical representatives, when consulted, provided explanations that had nothing to do with radium. This is the part of the story where the horror pivots from the tragic to the calculated. Because the United States Radium Corporation, by the early 1920s, was no longer operating in ignorance. The company's own researchers, scientists employed by the same institution that was assuring its workers of radium safety, had been studying the effects of radium exposure on biological tissue. The scientific literature on radiation, while still developing, contained enough evidence by the early 1920s to make the direction of that evidence unmistakable to anyone reading it carefully. The company was reading it carefully. The company had commissioned studies. The company had data. And the company made a decision. The decision was not to stop the practice, not to inform the workers, not to change the technique or provide protective equipment or acknowledge, even privately, any responsibility for what was happening to the women on their factory floor. The decision was to manage the information, to control what the dying women knew, what their families understood, what the public heard, and what could ever be proved in a court of law. The mechanism of that management was one of the more complete betrayals that the forbidden archives contain. The company directed sick workers to company-approved physicians. Physicians who examined women presenting with symptoms consistent with radiation poisoning and produced diagnoses of other conditions entirely. The specific diagnosis deployed against multiple women, documented in the legal proceedings that eventually followed, was syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease, a condition that, in the moral framework of the 1920s, carried devastating social consequences and implied a specific personal history that no respectable woman wanted associated with her name. The corporation was not making a medical error. It was making a calculation. A diagnosis of syphilis accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It provided an alternative explanation for the symptoms that deflected attention from the factory. It attached a social stigma to the dying women that would make their claims less credible if they ever made them publicly, and it located the cause of their illness in their own personal behavior rather than in their employer's practices. It blamed the victims for their deaths using the most devastatingly effective social weapon available in the 1920s. And then it continued operating. The women who received these diagnoses, women who had given their youth and their health and their bones to a company that had taught them to put its product in their mouths, now found themselves not only dying but publicly accused, by the company's own medical apparatus, of the kind of personal failing that 1920s society did not forgive. The invisible poison was already in their bones. The corporation had now put something in their reputations. And it had done so deliberately, methodically, with the full understanding of what it was doing and why. The women fought back. This is the part of the story that the corporation had not adequately accounted for in its calculations. The possibility that women who were dying, who had been lied to, who had been publicly slandered by the institution responsible for their condition, would find within themselves the particular quality of fury that transforms victims into something else entirely. Grace Fryer, Catherine Donahue, the 5 women who became known as the Radium Girls, their bodies failing, their bones fragile in ways that made some of them unable to raise their hands to take an oath in court, pursued the United States Radium Corporation through the legal system with a determination that their physical condition made almost incomprehensible. Finding lawyers willing to take the case was difficult. The corporation was well-resourced and had demonstrated its willingness to use those resources aggressively. The statute of limitations questions were complex. The medical evidence, while available, required expert interpretation that had to be assembled against institutional resistance. They pursued it anyway. The 1928 settlement and the subsequent legal victories in Illinois did not restore what had been taken. No legal proceeding could do that. The stolen time could not be returned. The bones could not be healed. The years of the women's youth that had been consumed by a corporation that understood exactly what it was doing and chose to continue doing it, those years were gone, and no judgment could recover them. But the proceedings were public. The evidence that emerged, the company's own internal documents, the testimony of its scientists, the paper trail of a cover-up conducted with the institutional thoroughness that made it both effective and, eventually, damning, became part of the record. A record that journalists reported, that the public read, that legislators could not ignore once the full dimensions of what had happened became clear. The Radium Girls did not live to see the full transformation their cases produced. The labor safety regulations that followed, the establishment of occupational health standards, the principle that an employer bears legal and moral responsibility for the conditions it knowingly imposes on its workers, these developments unfolded over years and decades, shaped by multiple forces of which the Radium Girls were one. But they were a foundational one. Their cases established, in American legal and regulatory history, that a corporation cannot hide behind manufactured medical diagnoses when it knows it is poisoning its workers. That the internal knowledge of an institution, what it knew when it knew it, and what it chose to do with that knowledge, is a matter of legal relevance. That the women on the factory floor, the ones performing the work and absorbing its costs, were not simply resources to be managed and, when damaged, discarded and slandered. They were people, and people, it turned out, could glow. Not with radium, with the particular, terrible luminosity of those who have been wronged completely and refuse to be extinguished quietly. The women of the United States Radium Corporation walked home through the New Jersey dark in their glowing dresses, beautiful and unknowing, poisoned and happy, and the corporation that had put that glow in their bones and their smiles and their best clothes watched them go and knew what it had done and said nothing. Their light outlasted the corporation. Their cases outlasted the era. Their names, Grace, Catherine, Albina, Quinta, and the others, the ones who glowed and sued and died and changed the world from their sickbeds, are in the record, placed there by their own insistence, against every effort of an institution that had decided their silence was worth more than their lives. It was wrong about that. It is always wrong about that. History does not bury its horrors because they are unimportant. It buries them because they are mirrors, and the reflection never quite goes away. This has been the Forbidden Archives. The files are never truly closed.